Evening, it's Diane Sayre with the Sayre for Senate New York Symposium on Friday, April 14th. And we are on the eve of a very important conference of the Schiller Institute, which is starting Saturday morning, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Eastern. And I would encourage everybody to watch this conference. A couple of days ago, Helga Zepp-LaRouche said that we are actually on the cusp of an epochal change, even potentially greater than the Italian Golden Renaissance after the Dark Ages. Now, I know that's very hard for people in the United States and the Western world to imagine, because what we're experiencing is increasingly fascist policies coming from our governments, economic collapse, infrastructure in shambles, and nothing but a talk of war and who our enemies are around the world. But there is an entirely new paradigm coming into existence, one for which Lyndon LaRouche fought his entire life, to replace the imperialist colonial relics of the British Empire through the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but a new development architecture, which is now being led by a group of nations, China most importantly, Russia, the BRICS countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. And this has been encouraged and accelerated by the insane policies coming from the Biden administration in our proxy war against Russia, using Ukraine in a most sadistic and hideous fashion, I have to say, driving nations to accelerate their cooperation. So just a couple of updates. One, President Lula of Brazil is in Beijing, and they had a ceremony with Dilma Rousseff, who is now the former Brazilian president, who is becoming the head of the BRICS New Development Bank. And at the ceremony for that, Lula said that this is going to be the new bank of the world. He has just met with Xi Jinping, and we'll be hearing more about that soon. Also, there are developments between Brazil and Argentina, and an affront to our Undersecretary of State, Wendy Sherman. Argentina had defense ministry officials from China visiting, who were selling supersonic jets manufactured in China and Pakistan. So the world no longer believes that they have to stick in the straitjacket of this Anglosphere domination. Not one of 54 African nations has been willing to condemn Russia. And I think Americans don't have a sense how much we have lost control and respect of anyone in the planet. Now, I also want to say a couple of things about the leaks of these papers from someone at the Pentagon. The Washington Post is now saying that this was a young man working at American military base. I don't think such a young man would be working on their own. Also, as Ray McGovern and Jim Jatras said in an interview they just did with Sputnik, it's a mishmash of intelligence. Some is accurate, some is a mess. Clearly, it does indicate, as they said, a policy division in the Pentagon, in the military establishment, that does not want to go down this insane road of provoking potential thermonuclear war with Russia or China. And then Seymour Hersh, who has launched his gift that keeps on giving with his expose of the U.S. detonation of the Nord Stream pipelines, along with the UK, Norway, and many other nations, has written an article saying that there is a total breakdown of trust between the White House and the intelligence community. And he said that an ambassador he spoke with described the U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan as being little more than a jumped-up congressional staffer or a political campaign manager. They're not qualified diplomats. The intelligence community has lost faith in them. They believe that they and Biden are living in a totally different world than reality. And I will say that that was definitely my experience when I intervened at an event couple nights ago of journalists who were gathered to bemoan the arrest of the Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkowitz, who was picked up receiving classified information in Yekaterinburg, a major production area for military supplies for Russia's the war that Russia is involved in with Ukraine. They were sending postcards and so on. But my sense of being with these journalists is they live in a bubble. They believe their own narrative, and they can't even imagine that anyone else wouldn't believe it. And they're there talking about how Russia is cracking down on freedom of the press, literally on the anniversary of Julian Assange's being locked up in Belmarsh prison. The 4-year anniversary of that was on April 11th. So you see the utter hypocrisy. We also see that with this supposed beheading of a Ukrainian POW by a Russian soldier. It comes perfectly timed for the Russian victory, which is pending at Bakhmut. Zelensky has been all over the press saying everyone should aid us now. US senators have been visiting with Zelensky in Ukraine. They'll come back to make pleas for more weapons. And if we can't produce weapons fast enough, maybe we'll be asked for troops. Is anyone going to verify whether this actually is real? The Russians have said that it is a horrific video, but the first thing is to determine its authenticity. They already, looking at the uniforms, have said it doesn't mesh with the alleged Russians who would have done it. And again, we have seen so much propaganda, so much fake intelligence. It reminds me a little bit of when Xi Jinping was here for his first visit with Putin. Trump had been very clear that he intended to remove our troops from Syria. And the next thing you know, we're told that Assad is supposedly using chemical weapons on his own population, which makes no sense at all. He hadn't used chemical weapons on ISIS. And why would he do that at the very point that there was hope that the US might withdraw their troops? But we were supposed to believe that, and it was used to get some meaningless strikes on Syria. And timed to disrupt a very important head of state meeting. So we will see what the truth of this is. But so with all of that, I just really would encourage people to be at the Schiller Institute conference. It's online tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m. And the following week is a SARE for Senate meeting in Manhattan, which you can register for on my website. I will say, as always, participation in the SARE for Senate Symposium does not constitute endorsement of a political campaign, but is to make sure certain issues are addressed, and this information is available to the public. So I have two very special guests, and I'm first going to introduce you to Hussein Asghari, who is the Schiller Institute Southwest Asia correspondent. He has been an associate of LaRouche and the Schiller Institute for 25 years. He's also the vice president of the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden, and originally from Iraq. And what we're going to be discussing are these kind of amazing agreements between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the implications particularly for Yemen. But I understand that there's just been a Syrian delegation in Saudi Arabia, so there's more progress there, which you might to bring up as well. So thanks very much for joining me, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Diane. It's a great honor for me to be with you. And yes, we have an incredible situation breaking out in the whole region, and this is something which should have happened 20 years ago. Actually. But as the Chinese say, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So I would elaborate more on this because Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Tsepp-LaRouche, the LaRouche movement, myself, were involved in these developments actually 20 years ago to make this happen, but it did not happen. And instead, we had the Iraq invasion and other matters. So this is a very, very fascinating time. Maybe the whole world was not ripe for this development, but yeah, interesting to look at. There is something we share, Diane and I, is a vision which says that if you don't believe in the future, you won't survive the moment. And that's one reason that the Iraqi people, for example, have survived all the disasters and wars and horrific things, that they believe there's a future where things will get better. But this is reflected in the thinking of myself, but also other members of the LaRouche movement, because LaRouche has a famous paradoxical statement. It says that the future determines the present and even the past, because the idea you have of the future will determine your behavior today and what kind of things you're going to do today to reach that point in the future. So I was myself surprised to look back after this announcement of the ceasefire in Yemen and the prolonging of the ceasefire, but also the process of rapid normalization of relations between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, or the government in Sana'a, which the Saudis did not recognize before. And now there has been a delegation in Sana'a to go over details of not only ceasefire, but the peace process. And now I look back at what we did. I mean, from the beginning of this war, we opposed it. Helga LaRouche, the Schiller Institute, were opposed to it. But from the very, very beginning, we were very clear on the fact that the Saudis, the Saudi coalition, and backed by the United States and Britain and many other nations, they will not win this war because there are very specific characteristics of Yemen, both the people and the country, which will make it almost impossible to overcome the Yemenis. Similar thing like in Afghanistan. And I remember just 2 days after the Saudis started the bombing campaign, I read a very interesting blog by a former DIA officer, Patrick Lang, in which he described how the Yemenis are and why they will win this war. It was just 3 days after it. And Graham Fuller had a similar thing. Graham Fuller is well known to the Schiller Institute. He also made a similar argument. So I had that also in mind to carry. But when I was looking back at what we did with the question of reconstruction of Yemen, and I found this video from 2018, which talks about the future. And I made some clips of it. So if people can see it first, they get the point.
Okay.
Thank you. Yemen is, I think, the perfect case of turning tragedy into a victory not only for Yemen or the Yemeni people, but for all mankind. And I will explain why. For 3.5 years, as our friends have discussed, the Saudi war on Yemen, backed by Britain, the United States, and France, and other countries, has brought with it many tragedies, but also many ironies. It showed that the apparently weak do not necessarily have to lose in the face of the mighty. Yemenis, while admittedly being the poorest people in the region, have a deep sense of historical identity and a culture that goes back thousands of years into history. They are a proud people with a Republican sense of freedom, and a rough landscape they have that is very advantageous in defensive warfare. All these factors made them capable of resisting the Saudi coalition, backed by some of the most powerful military forces on the planet for more than 3 years. But that was at a very, very high price, as we have seen. Another irony is that right in the middle of the worst war and humanitarian crisis, some Yemenis, and for the duration of the war, have been studying economics as defined by Lyndon LaRouche and the Schiller Institute in order to figure out how to build a modern economy and avoid the disasters of the past. They also have been studying the new Silk Road and want Yemen to join the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS. As I said in my opening remarks earlier, to survive tragedy, you have to look towards the stars, i.e. at the future, and derive inspiration and courage from them to survive the current fight and also pave the way to solving the crisis. Earlier this month, on June 6th, a seminar was held in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, right under the ongoing escalation of the war. Can I have the first image? It was held at the headquarters of the Yemeni General Investment Authority, where the Sana'a Declaration was issued. I have to explain for you just, the man standing to the left is Fouad al-Ghaffari. He is now the head of the preparatory committee of the New Silk Road Party in Yemen, and he also is organizing young people to form what he calls a BRICS youth government. And he has been leading the initiative in Yemen to introduce LaRouche's economics, and at least one school in Yemen now are preparing to teach LaRouche economics in their schools. Because this is really a act of courage and defiance in the face of the most horrible war being launched on their country, because they say, we are not give up in the face of this. We will develop our intellectual powers to defeat the enemy, even, mentally. So, because we have a future to fight for. We are not fighting just to survive. We are fighting to have a future. So in that seminar, where the declaration, Sana'a Declaration, adopted an 80-page Schiller Institute report. It's called Operation Felix, Yemen's Reconstruction and Connection to the New Silk Road. I am the main author of the report. The GIA Deputy Director, who was in the picture sitting to the right, Engineer Khaled Sharafuddin, opened the seminar by thanking Helga LaRouche, Chairman of the Schiller Institute, for her and her organization's relentless support to the Yemeni people. He expressed his full support to the proposals made in the report and stressed that the Yemeni General Investment Agency will work on two tracks with the government in Sana'a. One is to translate this report into an action plan for the government, and the other track is to thoroughly study all the infrastructure and financial proposals made in the report in order to launch the reconstruction process as soon as the war of aggression is stopped. So anyway, we go directly to the how to reverse this policy. And we could say, as our friend said, that the Republic of Yemen enjoys a unique geographical position at the intersection point of the land-based economic belt of the New Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road of the 21st century, the red and the yellow. Thus becoming a key component of this giant development project and benefiting from it at the same time. Yemen has also abundant natural resources and a diverse climate that makes it suitable for integrated agro-industrial development. What is lacking in Yemen, though, like in many parts of Africa, is what Lyndon LaRouche calls the economic platform. The platform of basic infrastructure to lift all these resources to higher levels of productivity and to bring into being their potential. The key component in the development plan proposed in this report is the construction of the Yemeni Development Corridor, or corridors, modeled on LaRouche's concept of the development corridor. Now, when you look at our maps of the Silk Road or the World Land Bridge, you see all these lines crossing the continents. These are not just a railway or a camel caravan carrying goods from the east to the west. These are, the concept is to build what we call, what LaRouche calls the development corridor, which is 100 to 150 kilometer wide. This is a cross-section of it, which includes railways, roads, water canals, oil and gas pipelines, power lines, nuclear-powered new cities and agro-industrial centers. So this should be this is the concept that will stretch from the east to the west, opening new areas with potential development, but they need these tools to be able to raise the potential which exists in their countries. the report conceptualizes the Yemeni development corridors with the main spine extending from Sada to Aden. This is the main, we call it the spine or the backbone. And then you have the limbs going to the port cities, but also to the plateau, which is has a great potential for development, but also along the coast, which will benefit from the maritime Silk Road. And then the third concentration is that Yemen should be connected to the Belt and Road, initiative. It will be connected to the Belt and Road, to the land part of the Belt and Road through projects connecting to Oman and across the Hormuz Strait to Iran and further to Central Asia, but also to Russia. And also there is a proposal for a bridge or a tunnel across the Bab el-Mandeb Strait to connect to Djibouti, Ethiopia, and the rest of Africa. Now, in the future, of course, if there will be peace, this does not exclude the fact that Yemen is connected to the rest of West Asia with Saudi Arabia, with the Gulf countries, and so on and so forth to Europe. But at the moment, the perspective for doing that immediately is not there. But it's very important that in the future that the Yemenis and the Saudis are reconciled. Now, many tribes on the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I mean, their nationality is not really identified. They are Saudis or Yemenis. Nobody knows if they are Saudis or Yemenis. Therefore, the borders of Yemen with Saudi Arabia have not been really demarcated. So the people in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, they share, even in a tribal sense, they share a common destiny. In conclusion, I would just like to say that in the June 6th seminar in Sana'a, which I described earlier, I propose that the government there adopts this plan as a key component in any peace and reconciliation talks between the different Yemeni belligerent parties, and that this would be agreed upon before, that this would be the mission of the future Yemeni government, that everybody agrees that this is what we want to do when we have peace. Not to have peace, as I say in the report, we don't want to reconstruct Yemen to what it was before the war. Because before the war, as we remember, Yemen was the poorest country in the region. So it's not our intention to bring Yemen back to what it was. We want to transform Yemen into the future. In the same time, thank you. In the same time, it's a means of motivating the international community to consider the absurdity of the continuation of this war, and the fact that the people controlling the government in Sana'a are not mere militias with power ambitions, but are statesmen with visions and knowledge. The responsibility to stop this genocidal war is upon every individual and every government in the world today. The vision for launching a genuine reconstruction and development plan in Yemen is in harmony with the new paradigm of cooperation in the world as expressed in this conference so far. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fascinating in a way that at that time, the only news coming out of Yemen because of the horrible blockade and war is that a Yemeni child dies every 10 seconds. So what would people do in that situation is usually say, well, we have to do something for those children. But the issue is, like being part of the LaRouche area, and actually I say Mr. LaRouche because he was still sitting there alive in front of us, so I was addressing him. It was one of the last conferences he attended. That this is the issue, that you have always to fight for the future. You cannot just reconcile with because there is a war, you can accept anything to end the war. But the Yemenis, as I said, did not fight the war just simply to have quiet, because that quiet situation was a disaster. The people were poor, there was corruption, and the putting things in a completely different light is what was necessary. Now, you hear I talk about reconciliation between Yemenis and Saudi Arabia. Everybody thought it was absurd to say such a thing at that time. Even people in Yemen said, no, 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 we will never become friends with Saudi Arabia. They are killing us. They're destroying our country. They're killing our children. Forget about it. You know, but this is the spirit, you know, the Peace of Westphalia spirit, when people are confronted with the choice between having peace and reconciliation and reconstruction, or a continuation of this absurdity. Of course, rational human beings will choose to go for peace. So this is a very, very interesting story, and I'm very hopeful that, of course, this comes out of the, in a certain sense, of the China achievement in bringing together Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was actually a process. It wasn't something new, but this is one of the results of that. The whole region is affected by that. Patrick Lang, at the time, when the article I mentioned, which he wrote 3 days after the war started in 2000, he said, don't look at the Houthis or Ansarullah as Iran proxies or agents. This is an independent force. As I said also in my, those are people with very, very strong sense of independence and freedom, because they have an Asian culture. They're very proud people. And this is one of the touchy points for the Gulf countries, who were tribal, you know, chieftains brought together by the British, and their states existed only for, you know, a few decades. So the original plan was, after the regime change process started with Libya, Egypt, Syria, and so on, and Yemen was affected, the idea was to dismember Yemen, to kill its character as a republic, because Yemen is a republic, unlike all the other nations in the region, and a unified republic. Now, we have still this issue of the southern separatist group, who are very powerful, and they are supported still by international powers. How Yemen will be reunited is still a big question, but one of the ideas which I present in this plan for reconstruction is to unite the country economically, first of all, by building these development corridors from north to south, east to west. So, but the idea was to dismember Yemen into 6 or 7, a confederation of 6 or 7 tribal states. Like you have the Houthis, they are Zaydis, they are in the north. It's okay for the others to have that, a Houthi state in the north, no problem. But it should not control the resources of the country or be the power in the capital. And then you will have all these different tribes in different parts of Yemen. They will constitute different federal states. And that way it's easier to control them, control the natural resources, the gas, the oil, but also the geographical location, the ports in Aden, in Hodeidah, Al-Baida, and so on, by other, you know, powers. So this whole plan failed. And it's interesting that, I mean, it's important now to talk about peace and reconciliation. We don't want to attack Saudi Arabia or the other countries who are involved in this process. I think Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made very, very big changes in the policy of Saudi Arabia, and a great defiance, and taking a big risk, which I would like to talk about, because Saudi Arabia was also slated for regime change. This is something very few people have noticed. The idea was to replace actually Mohammed bin Salman with another prince who was easier to control. The Obama administration plan was to keep the region involved in this proxy war, and one day siding with Iran, one day siding with Saudi Arabia, but keeping the whole region cooking. And at the same time, making sure that even Saudi Arabia does not have enough power to become a predominant independent country. The whole story of, for example, Jamal Khashoggi, the so-called journalist, who is not really a journalist. He was an intelligence agent for the Saudis, but also part of the Anglo-American intelligence operations going all the way back to the Mujahideen war in the 1980s, where he was there reporting on the great victories of the Mujahideen against the Soviets for Washington Post and New York Times and the other. But he continued in his role. He was also the secretary of the intelligence director of Saudi Arabia, Prince Turki al-Faisal, even when Turki al-Faisal became ambassador to London in 2002. Now, the reason we know a lot of things is because we engage those people in the fight with the Anglo-American power, but also they have their own agents. And we got into a direct fight with Jamal Khashoggi in 2002 in the preparation for the invasion of Iraq. Because from his position, remember, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche was in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi in May 2002. That was about 9 months before the invasion of Iraq. Everybody knew that the Bush administration was preparing for the invasion. Mr. Lyndon LaRouche presented what we see now happen, actually. I think I can share with you so you can get a direct sense of the reason we know these things because we were involved. I mean, Lyndon LaRouche and the Sure, so we don't sit here and analyze things. We engage in both fighting the imperial forces, but also engage in presenting ideas and policies and educate people around the world. And this is something LaRouche has done. He did all his life. And I was fortunate to be involved in this process in 2002, whereby in the United Arab Emirates, and also in the whole Gulf, you had a factional fight going on because there are people who did not really support the invasion of Iraq. And one of them was the Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, the president of the United Arab Emirates, but also one of his sons was the prime minister, deputy prime minister of the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi, Sheikh Sultan bin Zayed, who was the chairman and founder of this center. And they took a huge risk by inviting Lyndon LaRouche, despite the protest of the American, British, Canadian, New Zealand, Australian embassies, to make him the keynote speaker in a major conference about the future of oil and gas in the region. But the real issue was that they knew that Lyndon LaRouche was the biggest opponent of this imperialist Anglo-American policy. Also, Helga Sepp-LaRouche spoke about the dialogue of civilizations, and Lyndon LaRouche himself got engaged with, like in this case, a prominent Saudi financial and economic advisor to the government. So there was the vision that Lyndon LaRouche presented is to, given the enormous financial and economic crisis, and he even talked about taking the lifeboats from the Titanic sinking with the banking crisis coming, which it did come later. But he also presented the vision of this region. Instead of being the cockpit of empires, where all the big empires are fighting, into a crossroads of the continents. That in this region, you have not only the fantastic geographical location, within this circle, you have about 400 million people, mostly young. You have 2/3 of the world oil and gas reserves, and you have an enormous financial resource. I mean, the joint sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf countries right now is almost $4 trillion. The problem is that that money is invested in financial markets and utilities and real estate in London and New York and other parts of the world, instead of being invested in infrastructure industry, which is now happening thanks to the Chinese involvement, which I can come to. So the idea was to unite this whole region in peaceful cooperation and integrate it into the Belt and Road. The Belt and Road did not exist at that time, but Lyndon LaRouche and Helga Sepp-LaRouche and we all were working since 1996 at least, when we produced the first Eurasian Land Bridge report, how to integrate Europe, Africa, Asia, together with development corridors, which I described in the video. and also going from there to the World Land Bridge to connect the Americas to this massive project. So this is what is going on now. We lost 20 years. But as I said, everything has a reason. And therefore this project, LaRouche's project, maybe today is the time for it to be implemented. Now, what happened in the meantime, as we know, we had the Iraq invasion, we had the continuation of the war in Afghanistan. We had also the regime change wars starting under Obama, and this whole destabilization of all those countries. Now, the Gulf countries played a key role in that as proxies for the Anglo-American interest. But then gradually, when Russia intervened in September 2015 in Syria, putting their feet down, drawing a red line and say, this regime change nonsense is going to end here and now. And we are deploying all our military force to make sure that this does not succeed. Now, that came 1 year after the coup in Ukraine, where the Russians were also threatened in that front. But the Russian move to prevent the collapse of the Syrian state was very decisive. And gradually from there, also with the cooperation of Iran, Russia, and even Iraq, which became plagued with the ISIS problem. So you had a front with Russia, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and Hezbollah and Lebanon, working together to defeat the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Nusra Front, and so on and so forth in that region. So from there, and also because of the, you had in Egypt in 2011, the Mubarak government was overthrown, and 2 years later, you had elections, but the Muslim Brotherhood came to power. And Muslim Brotherhood was completely united with the British, the Obama administration, and specifically Qatar and Turkey. But they had some sort of a Faustian agreement with the Saudis. But then 1 year later, there was a coup in Egypt, a revolt against the people. So the military in Egypt, with the popular uprising against the Muslim Brotherhood, took power again, and they arrested and got rid of the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates supported al-Sisi and the new government in Egypt, but Qatar and Turkey continued to support the Muslim Brotherhood, and that created a schism. But also gradually, Saudi Arabia withdrew from supporting the opposition in Syria. You had the military operations center in Jordan, which was actually chaired by Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally before he became crown prince. That was dissolved. And then Saudi Arabia took a backseat in that. Now, there was in that process, and also in the process of Prince Mohammed bin Salman trying to take control in Saudi Arabia and pull Saudi Arabia out of that geopolitical game, he got into a confrontation with Qatar, Turkey, the Muslim Brotherhood, and some elements inside Saudi Arabia. And that's where the Jamal Khashoggi story and his cooperation with the Obama administration and other Democrats in the United States come into this picture.
Great. I want to actually bring in my second guest, because you've given us an enormous amount, and I think he may have some comments or questions, and then we can open it up. My other guest here is, let me just, Craig Pasta Jardula, who is a political commentator, has a well-known podcast, Convo Couch, and joined me as a speaker at the Rage Against the War Machine. And he specializes in elections and foreign affairs. And so, Pasta, if you have some things you'd like to say, and then we can open it up.
Wow, what an introduction. Thank you so much for having me on. And thank you, Hussein, for that. It's just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, I think shows like this are so important because we need to pay attention to foreign policy. Too many Americans just don't understand what's going on in Yemen. I mean, if you can make a Netflix series about Yemen, there's so much juicy stuff there. There's so much going on. I think that was what was laid out is the most important. I've always believed that Yemen was a proxy war to stop China because of its geographical location. There's certain islands that are seem to be still up for grabs. Nobody understands really who owns these islands, who's trying to take control of them. One of the islands being Socotra, where the UAE was actually issuing visas to Israeli citizens to go there at one point. And then, of course, you have the Hanesh Islands, which are, I believe, in is it the Arabian Sea or the Red Sea? I believe it's
in the Red Sea.
It's in the Red Sea, where there's conflicts over those particular islands as well. So, this to me has always been about trade. This has always been about the Belt and Road Initiative. This has always been about the United States and its partners slowing down China's ability to push forth the Belt and Road Initiative. And so now we see these situations coming to an end, hopefully, with this delegation going up. You were mentioning MBS. I did think at one point when the Biden administration got in, they would coup him and put Mohammed bin Nayef back in. He had a little bit more connections to Langley and whatnot. And obviously MBS right now with the moves he's been making, so much with China as well, agreeing to sell oil and take yuan for it. I mean, this story is only beginning to unfold. Even if the delegation goes well, I believe in Sana'a, we still have certain situations that have to play out within Yemen, like the STC, which is another group proxy, I believe, of UAE, was very heavily funded. That is another group within inside that country that we're going to have to see what happens with them. I think the STC, and correct me if I'm wrong, Hussein, had more power, more land than the Houthi government that was eventually removed, which was the Saudi.
Yes, these are the
government.
southern separatist group, or the former South Yemen.
Yeah. I think people really need to pay attention and take a look at what's happening in Yemen. I've never been there. I want to go there myself. I've talked about going to Socotra one day. But there's so many great stories. At one point, I believe Yemen was the only communist country in the Middle East back in the days, the Yemeni Socialist Party. So there's this rich history that goes on in Yemen. And I mean, China has 3 bases outside of its own country, one of them being in Djibouti, right across from Yemen. So, I mean, this area is a very highly contested area. It's a very highly contested country. I think that's why this war was waged on for so long. In the beginning, Diane, you had mentioned the BRICS countries and Lula showing up over there. I believe that was another area in which the United States government was trying to pull away Brazil from their relationships in China. So at the end of the day, I think China is one of the big questions when people have to ask what is actually going on, why this is happening. There's so many stories that are taking place. Israel is even involved with some of the funding, with some of these groups too as well. So I would encourage people to learn as much as they can about Yemen and start paying attention, because anything that happens in the United States, it seems to happen overseas. Any type of tactics the empire tries to play on its own people, it seems they practice it abroad. And I've always said, you got to pay attention to foreign policy, because one day these chickens will come home to roost. And a lot of the policies we see and a lot of the oppression in the United States seems to be tried before in all these other countries. So thank you so much for having me on. And I mean, so many great questions and so many things that we have to pay attention to. And, for me, the big thing is, on Easter, hearing the news that this particular council, this delegation was going to Sana'a, for me, a happiness, because the situation, when I first asked about Yemen and I was talking to people in the region, they said, it's kind of like Fight Club. There's 2 rules. Number 1, you don't mess with the Houthis. They're not going to bend. They're not going to break. I said, what's the second rule? You still don't mess with the Houthis. So, knowing that the situation was going on and the famine that was taking place, that what you had said, 1 child dies every 10 seconds, or is every
10 seconds. Yeah, that was
it's terrible. And, President Biden, one of the first things he talked about when he got into office was ending this war. Well, he never did. Years later, he gave the Saudis even more weapons to go and kill the Houthis. So this happening with the Chinese brokering, this deal, and there were some people who gave China a lot of criticisms, along with Russia, for some of their votes in the UN Council when they said they were cozying up to the Saudis and voting to continue the blockade, which was so damaging to the Houthis. But it seems like they were playing the long game, and they were able to woo them away from the United States, and now brokering this deal and a chance for peace. It is an exciting moment, and hopefully things will work out in Yemen, and we can see some peace in Yemen. But like I said, there's a lot of things that still haven't unfolded yet. We still have these islands. We still have Socotra. We still have the Hanish Islands. And I'm just curious to see what happens. But yes, this was a very positive thing, and I'm looking forward to hopefully some peace.
Well, Pasta, that's why I wanted you to be in this discussion, because I also felt this was an amazing breakthrough, having followed this. And I do want to say here, I would like to dedicate this program to my late fellow organizer, Marcia Malouk, who did so much work to help create the organization in Yemen and who succumbed to cancer just in the last year or so. But that optimism is the right response. And people are so jaded, or even people who've been fighting for peace for such a long time, here it is it's right in front of you, the opportunity, and you say, no, this can't be happening. We know the Chinese are just the same as the Anglo-American imperialists. They just want to steal the raw materials. They're using slave labor. And you don't see that the situation actually has changed. So when I saw your tweet about Yemen, I said, yes, this is right. We have to bring this to the American people because they have no idea what's happening in the world. And Hussein, I'd like your response on that.
Yeah, no, this is very important, but also this idea of optimism, but also that Russia and China, yes, they did vote for the resolution which gave them, the Saudis, the sanction to attack Iran, but they kept some sort of contact the whole time. But also, as you say, they were on for the long term, but also the fact that they kept their friendship with Saudi Arabia, their channels of communication with Saudi Arabia, but at the same time with the Yemenis, and it enabled them to play this role. And also, of course, their strong relationship to Iran. Iran does have a certain influence, a friendly influence in Yemen, but also, Yemen is not only the Houthis. What the Houthis managed to do is, remember, they managed actually to make sure that ISIS did not take over all of Yemen in 2014, as they did in parts of Iraq and parts of Syria. There was a plan to have ISIS taking over Sana'a, and the Houthis went down to Sana'a and they prevented that. And then they established a national salvation government with the former so-called secular National Popular Congress. The prime minister of Sana'a and the foreign minister, who are our friends of the Schiller Institute, they spoke in our conferences. They are not Houthis. They are members of the National Popular Congress. So the Houthis managed to also bring back the Yemeni army, although they are the core of it, but they managed. And then they did, in 2 months before the war with Saudi Arabia broke out, they cleaned large parts of Yemen from Al-Qaeda, something which the FBI, the United States, and the former Yemeni government took 10 years without success. By going to the tribes in those regions where Al-Qaeda was active and making deals with them. They didn't even fight. They said, look, we are Yemenis. These are foreign elements. They are not good. We don't want to have a fight with you. Let's work together. So they united the country, except for the very, very south, where the separatists are, and managed to do that. Now, the important element here is that it's mind-boggling how the Saudis make this change. And I think there's this background. First of all, they sensed that there was an attempt for a coup in Saudi Arabia, to weaken Saudi Arabia. That's why we had the diplomatic crisis with Qatar and Turkey. It's difficult to go through all the details here, but then there's an economic financial aspect of things, because you remember, we had oil shocks. The Saudi economy almost collapsed. We had in 2014, first of all, after the oil price, Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf countries are totally dependent on exporting oil for everything. And that's a very big vulnerability. In 2008, with the financial crisis breaking out, the oil price went down from 140 to almost 30 and stayed there for a while. Then it rose again. And in 2014, the oil price collapsed to below 30. Again, I mean, to sustain these societies, you need an oil price above $80 per barrel. And that was the second major shock to Saudi Arabia and these Gulf countries. And then in 2020, the oil price went also down very, very dramatically. So the Saudis, although they have a lot of financial assets, but they are invested in City of London, in New York, Wall Street, and real estate, and all kinds of things. They also invest in major corporations in the West. But now they realize, and Prince Mohammed bin Salman, after the 2014 oil shock, issued the Saudi 2030 vision and said, from now on, we're not going to be relying on exporting oil as raw material, but we want to turn our country into an industrial economy, and also support agriculture and other aspects, and employ the Saudi people into that process. The same thing happened in Emirates. This is what LaRouche proposed already in 2002. And he also advised the governments of the Gulf countries that they should not rely only on exporting oil. They should use the oil as an industrial base for petrochemical industries, plastics, paints, all kinds of things, which will raise the value of every barrel of oil 10 times. But they should build nuclear power in the Gulf and use the oil and gas for industrial material. And the Emirates actually just completed the 4th nuclear reactor. They started in 2008. That was 5 years after LaRouche gave the advice. And now the 4th reactor is completed. So Saudi Arabia now is working with China. And it's very important that people go back and read the speech President Xi Jinping gave in last December to the Gulf Cooperation Council leaders. And there are 5 points he offered. He offered a menu, it's like magical thing. You know, working with the Gulf countries to build infrastructure, build petrochemical industries, scientific and technological cooperation in every field, cooperation in the Chinese space program, which includes training Gulf astronauts and participating in the Chinese moon mission, nuclear power. So, and then he also discussed the question of cooperation, financial cooperation, because you have $4 trillion of these countries' wealth funds that are not used for the benefit of humanity. So now suddenly these $4 trillion can be used for infrastructure and other productive projects along the whole Belt and Road constellation in Africa, in Asia, South America. But also Saudi Arabia now is investing. They just made a deal with China to build a $12 billion refinery and petrochemical plant inside China. So be financed by Saudi Arabia, jointly financed, but it will use Saudi oil to produce petrochemical materials for the huge Chinese. So this is the orientation of Saudi Arabia. China is building massive industries in Saudi Arabia with new ports. There's a new railway. There's a land bridge project called Saudi Arabia is building in to connect east and west of Saudi Arabia, north and south. You have raw materials, you have phosphate, you have aluminum, you have oil. So they're going to integrate the whole Gulf region with infrastructure, industries, modern agriculture, and so on. And China is the main player here. So this is a paradigm shift in economic thinking too. And thanks to the oil shocks, in a sense, that made the Gulf countries to wake up and look into a different direction, because the whole time since the 1971 oil crisis and also, 73 oil crisis, and also the end of the Bretton Woods system, the petrodollar became the big issue. And the Gulf countries, they would invest their money into the banks of the British and American banks, which would then lend the money to other nations and entrap them in debt traps. And that was the only purpose for the oil money. So the people say the United States and Britain wanted the oil. No, they didn't want the oil. They wanted the money from the oil not to be invested in development, but be invested in their failed financial banking system. Now that oil money would be invested in something beneficial for the world, but it's all in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative cooperation with China. You have also the whole integration of the region, which is now becoming easier because one of the big games is to keep Iran and the Gulf countries separate, that they should never ever cooperate, although they are so much common economically and geographically and every aspect. It's like keeping Russia and Germany always separate. That's one of the maxims of British geopolitics. Iran and the Gulf countries and Egypt should never work together. That has been the game. Now that they can work together, including economically, with Russia, China, and hopefully other European countries will go in, the United States can still have a chance to do that. It's not an exclusive club. But this is what the nature of things. And it took a long time, but now it's happening.
Yeah. I was just going to piggyback and say that a lot of people have to understand why I think the United States killed Soleimani. And Soleimani was trying to make that bridge to the Iranians, and they didn't want that to happen. They were trying to do anything they could to stop the pan-Arabism that was now taking place. But I think the reason why this is unfolding the way it is because the vulnerability of the United States and United States foreign policy. Instead of coming in and saying, hey, we can help you out with our engineering, our work, our resources, our manpower to help you build, they come in with a missile and they want a base there and whatnot, and they try to bully people around. And I think Saudi Arabia, seeing that they can now do business with Russia and China, is what's leading to all this. But they also understood too, as well, when the Chinese came to the table to make this work, you're going to have to make peace with Iran. And even though the Houthis are their own independent people, and we've talked about this as well, it did appear that they were getting some help with their drone programs from Iran, and being able to strike into the heart of Saudi Arabia, I think got the attention of the Saudis to say, hey, man, they're not going to roll over despite us getting a ton of weapons from the United States. And one day we might have to come to the table. And that day is here today. So, like I said, I hate to say that if you could write a Netflix series on this to get the attentions of the Americans, there's so much material here. There's so many moving parts. It's like a big web. And it is interesting to see all this play out.
I think what's really striking again, well, at a conference a couple of years ago, maybe, we had a delegation, we had a message from Fuad and the group in Yemen, and then Hussein, you had a presentation of these young Iraqis, a country that's been in war for about 30 years, totally devastated. The thing that really struck me, and Pasta, you may have also thoughts on this from your travels in various parts of the world, was here are people who are really suffering. I mean, horrific hardship of even whether you're going to be alive or dead the next day, but nonetheless hopeful and optimistic. And then you look at the United States or the Western Europe, where we presumably had a higher standard of living. I don't feel like I'm about to be bombed at any moment, or I'm not spending hours a day hiding in a basement. But the morale and the affect and demeanor is terrible. I mean, we have record suicides have tripled among 10 to 19-year-olds in the last few years. The drug overdoses are just on an upward trajectory. There's so much despair. And I would like the thoughts of both of you on why and the contrast and how we can change this.
Yeah. I would just say that
Frank.
It's American culture, right? Like where we're all at. There's so much destruction of the family. Everybody is consumed nowadays. How much do you have to work to just put a roof over your head and whatnot? You were talking about the suicide rate. Well, how about when it comes to ex-military personnel? They used to have the 22 for 22 days. You would do 22 push-ups for 22 days straight to show a movement of solidarity and bring attention to the 22 ex-military personnel that come home and kill themselves to PTSD. Well, I heard that number's up to close to 30 now, and it keeps rising. So I think the American culture, it's a little crazy. But you know, and not to be off topic, to get off topic, but I was curious to think about what's going to happen when Donald Trump, if he does come back into office with this region and everything, because you know, even though Donald Trump, they say, oh, he didn't start any new wars, but he was still, you know, playing ball with American foreign policy with the interventionist style. And obviously, a lot of people feel that MBS only got into power because of him and Kushner and him going along with these agreements to make sure that Saudi kept their distance from Iran, because obviously a lot of people that feel that Donald Trump is definitely one of the most friendliest presidents to the state of Israel, that is, and always kind of saber rattled with Iran. But I'm thinking about the mentality. If he gets back in, what's going to happen? What will his relationship be like with MBS? Or will they go back to maybe trying to coup him? I'm sorry for taking it off topic, but I've been waiting to ask that question for a little bit, Diane, because
I'm sure
you know,
a lot of people have that question. It's fine. It's not off topic. And Hussein can come back and tell us where we're going to find our optimism.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I
Go
think
ahead.
I can comment on that part about Trump, but the first question is, which is very important, is that, I mean, as you said, Craig, it's a question of culture. There's a problem with the culture. I mean, I'm not in a position to comment on the American culture. I don't live there, but from what I see is you have a terrible thing. But I think it's also the loss of purpose, the loss of a mission in life, both as an individual, but also as a citizen. And this is a kind of, there's a certain cynicism which has crept into people. And we see it here also in Europe. People don't care anymore about politics and politicians. They're all the same. And whoever you choose, you get the same results. And therefore, the whole nation has no purpose. And this is a quite dangerous thing, because at least in, for example, in Iraq or Yemen, first of all, there is a personal sense of mission, although it has a religious aspect, because you want to do good in life for the aftermath, so you can face your God with a clean face, that you have done your part on earth in life. You have been good to people. You have invested your life and time in a very good thing to help other people, take care of your family, take care of other human beings, and so on. These are the teachings of all the religions in the region: Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So at least on the personal level, there's a sense of mission, but also as a nationalist sense, it's still quite strong. You remember that the nations of the region have been under colonial powers for centuries. I mean, they had the Ottomans. Before that, you had even, the Persians, or the Safavid, or the Byzantine, and so on. So, but in the modern era, many nations, they can still see themselves still tied to the colonial powers, and they want to get out of that. So you have a very strong sense of liberation from colonialism still alive, but also the idea that you want to achieve as a nation goals of progress. We still look at other nations who have succeeded. I mean, people look at Germany after World War II, Japan, and now China. But also, I mean, the people respected the United States for a long time. That they say, why couldn't we become like this? And so that you have this idea that there is a purpose, that progress is like imperative. We have to become a developed nation. We have to build our country. We need to find how. And so there's a combination, but also you have this culture, both on an individual level, but also on a national level, of this freedom from colonialism, freedom from imperialism, but also progress. That idea of progress is still alive. We have a pessimistic culture in the West, which says industrialism, technological progress has destroyed our society, destroyed nature. Man is a beast, man is a parasite. And we don't have that sense in Asia, for example, or in the Middle East. I mean, even in China, people talk about green development. They don't mean the same green development they're talking about. They want a clean environment, but they want a high living standard, using modern technology, high technology, to achieve that. So that pessimism has not crept into societies there. So that's where the problem should be dealt with: the culture, to a sense of a mission, and to end this pessimism.
Do you want to say anything about the?
Yeah, I
Trump.
think President Trump, when he started, he made very interesting things. I mean, the whole ISIS regime change thing ended when Trump came in. He said, "I'm not going to support this anymore." And you remember the big conference he did in Saudi Arabia. The first trip he did was actually Saudi Arabia. And he brought all the leaders of the Muslim countries, and he said, "No more support for extremism." Now, people interpreted that he meant Iran, that all these guys there are good guys. But no, he said, "You were all involved in this dirty operation called the Islamic Mujahideen, and that ends now. We're not going to play that game anymore." But unfortunately, he always surrounded himself with bad people, John Bolton, Pompeo. For example, when he declared that we're going to get out of Syria, he did a very terrible thing. He went and played golf with Lindsey Graham. And I remember coming back, when he came back from the golf course with Lindsey Graham, he said, "Well, we're going to keep some troops there for the oil." Lindsey Graham, because Trump was under enormous pressure for impeachment, Russiagate, all these things, the people like Lindsey Graham and John McCain before that, these are, the dirty hands in the Republican Party who would threaten any president to follow the line, otherwise he will suffer. And I think this has been one of the biggest problems with Trump. He seems to have very brilliant ideas, but then the implementation becomes messy because he involves other people who are against these goals. So that was one of the reasons. You mentioned the case actually of Qasem Soleimani when he was killed in Baghdad. He was bringing a message back from the supreme leader of Iran to the Saudis through the Iraqi Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi. I have discussed the Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi also before he was couped in a color revolution immediately after he came back from China in September 2019, signing massive deals for oil for reconstruction and oil for technology deals. He was also subject to a coup. And the killing of Qasem Soleimani also ended the mediation the Iraqi side was carrying out between Saudi Arabia and so that was a huge, huge mistake Trump made. Obviously, he didn't really understand that this was at stake, but the people who planned that assassination knew that this is one of the goals.
Yeah. It's crazy how he gets persuaded by some of these establishment rhinos that he claims to be against. And when it comes to Latin America, Marco Rubio convinced him with a week left of his presidency to slap on harsh sanctions on Cuba and label them a state sponsor of terrorism. It's mind-blowing the way he gets persuaded by some of these establishment Republicans.
I think that's a weakness of being a businessman and not a statesman. A strength of being a businessman is war is bad for business. Nuclear war is very bad for business. You don't want to destroy countries. But if you feel like you have a deal with someone, or, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, then you're going to get into trouble. And I think we have to do a lot of work here in the US and also in Western Europe. I won't let you off the hook, Hussein, in Sweden, to change the thinking of the population and really to give up this cynicism, because you're missing the potential. It's looking you in the face and you're rejecting it. It sort of reminds me of that joke of the person who's on the roof. You've probably heard this, and there's been a hurricane and a tsunami and there are floods all around and they're just hanging there and they're praying to God to come and rescue them. Someone comes by in a rowboat and says, "Would you like to get on?" They say, no, I'm waiting for God. And then someone comes with a helicopter and says, "Will you come up?" They said, no, God said he's going to rescue me. I'm waiting for that. So then they finally drown and they get up to probably purgatory and they say, "What's the matter? I thought you were going to rescue me." And God says, "Well, I sent you a rowboat. I sent you a helicopter."
Yeah.
I feel like we're kind of in that situation. And I do think leadership is so badly needed. We have to give people a vision of where mankind could be. I think when the economy is as bad as it is, and you referenced that, Pasta, people are struggling. You've got to work 95 hours a week just barely to buy a dozen eggs or whatever is the latest item of the hyperinflation. you start thinking of your own personal survival, which is always a death trap, because then you don't consider how the world actually should be. What should the United States look like? What should our cities look like? What should the cities of Europe look like? What should the cities of Yemen look like? What is Haiti going to be when they stop recognizing Taiwan, if they ever allowed to even have a government, and work with China and modernize the entire city of Port-au-Prince? This is what we were born for. And I think one of the most horrible things that's been done to our military, to our veterans, is to send them into these meaningless conflicts based on lies with no purpose except destruction. And I think human beings are fundamentally good. It is in our conscience innately when we're born what is right and what is wrong. And when you are confronted with the results of your life, that is a devastating thought. But I think if we had a positive mission, if we would work with China on these initiatives for development, then we should go back to the former West Point view of the Army Corps of Engineers. All of our military people with this experience, all of these so-called military industrial complex companies, frankly, would be much more prosperous if they were building durable infrastructure as opposed to blowing everything up. And we could do something good. So let me just ask first, Pasa, if you have any thoughts and wrapping up, and then I'll go to Hussein.
No, I mean, just, yeah, I know it's hard to tell people to pay attention to these things. We were just mentioning it's so hard just to, put, some food on the table, keep a roof over your head. People are not just consumed with reality TV stars or Netflix or those other things. They're consumed with just trying to, live, to survive. And it could be dangerous. But I mean, if you do get a chance and you have some spare time and you can start to peek at, at what's going on outside your own borders, because it's all, death and destructions at the hands of our tax dollars, the United States government and the empire doing so. And they're spilling all this blood in our name. And it doesn't really represent what the people of the United States are. You mentioned that you think that, humans, generally are good people, they're good souls. And I honestly believe that about a lot of Americans. However, they just constantly get duped. They are blindsided about what's going on. So just to pay attention to shows like this and a journalist or activist who go to these areas and actually speak what's going on. And if you're paying attention to mainstream media and you're listening to our government, just stop. There are plenty other options out there to get a feel of what's really going on outside of our borders, and to hopefully, one day take power ourselves, and display a foreign policy and a humanity that really represents the United States people. So I hope we will work our way to that one day. And I thank you guys for so much for having me on, and Hussein, everything you do over there in that region. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hussein?
Yeah, well, I think the question of leadership you mentioned is very important. What you are doing, Diane, personally, and people, the LaRouche movement and other people fighting inside the United States, that this is very, very important, not only for the United States, but also for the rest of the world, because the rest of the world do need a good United States, and not a nuclear power, which is like a bull in the China shop. The thing is that it's very important to remind the point we said, there should be a vision of the future. As a statesman, as a government, or even as an individual, there should be a vision of the future. You have to show people where you want to be in a certain point in the future. The Chinese, this is not the political slogan. The Chinese have, President Xi Jinping says, by 2049, China will become a prosperous, culturally advanced, socialist, harmonious, and beautiful society. Now, who would not work day and night to achieve such a vision? This is the kind of idea you need to insert, not now, not in your lifetime, but down the road with your work today. you will achieve a harmonious and beautiful society. And this can also be thought about internationally in international relations. The very important that people don't fall into cynicism because of the pressure, psychological, material, and other pressure people are under. Just seize this moment, what's going on in Yemen, freeze it, and really try not to enjoy it, but this is what human beings are about. These guys, they hated each other. I mean, the crimes which were committed were horrendous. Suddenly, those people are shaking hands and say, look, if we can trust each other, if we can live as neighbors, we can help each other to prosper and take care of our children and give them a better future, everything is fine. Suddenly, the whole thing disappears. Like, people talk about the woman giving birth, how painful it is. As soon as the baby is delivered, all the pain disappears. And we have been through such a moment. And this is very important. This idea of the Westphalian peace is not just a piece of history. It's just really people can feel it. When peace is there, everything changes. People forget. Because their eye is now on the future. And that's very important for people in order not to fall into cynicism and say everything is bad. No, not everybody is bad. Things are going well in other parts of the world. Just need to join them.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. I would like to remind all of our listeners to please tune in tomorrow, Saturday morning at 9 a.m. to the Schiller Institute conference, and you will have a better sense of this. So thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.